Good evening and welcome to Reproaction's monthly Act and Learn webinar, our first webinar of 2018. Tonight's topic is Me Too, A Reckoning. Your hosts tonight are the co-founders and co-directors of Reproaction. This first hoarse, somewhat sick voice you hear is mine. I'm Erin Matson, based in Arlington, Virginia, and I'll leave it to my co-director to introduce herself.
Thank you so much, Erin. So this voice you're hearing right now is Pamela Merritt, and I am based in St. Louis, Missouri.
Great. So I'm going to do a rundown of our agenda for this evening. We're going to introduce Reproaction. Then we'll talk about the Me Too movement. We'll talk about the conservative response to the Me Too movement and the pronounced lack of accountability. And those portions will be presented by Jessica Ensley, our campaign coordinator, who's taken the lead on putting this webinar together, and thank you to Jessica for that. From there, we'll move to a panel discussion with the writer and journalist Sarah Seltzer. You may know her as she recently wrote a provocative piece in The Nation titled Me Too Has Debunked the Lean In Philosophy. From there, Jessica will talk about what you can do. We'll close with next steps, and then we'll do a Q&A. And I want to say at the outset, if you have questions for anyone specific or related to this webinar, you can chat them into the chat box at any time during the presentation, and we'll get to as many of them as possible at the end. So first, to introduce our organization, Reproaction is a new direct action group forming to increase access to abortion and advance reproductive justice. We're incredibly proud of our left flank analysis and our willingness to hold folks on all sides of our issues accountable, whether they're traditionally considered allies or opposition. One of the tools that we're deeply committed to in our toolbox is our commitment to nonviolent direct action. And with that, I'm going to introduce Jessica Ensley, our campaign coordinator with Reproaction. She's based in Washington, D.C. She uses the pronouns she and her, and you can find her on Twitter at Jessica Ensley. Jessica, I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thank you. And before I get started, I just want to give a trigger/content warning to those listening. I'm going to be talking about people accused of sexual assault, misconduct, and molestation, and going into some of the details of each of their cases. So just wanted to put that out there first. So to get started, the Me Too movement was actually created over a decade ago by Tarana Burke in 2006 as a grassroots movement to empower survivors of assault and abuse. Burke stated that it was a catchphrase to be used from survivor to survivor to let folks know that they were not alone and that a movement for radical healing was happening and possible. The Me Too movement came back into the spotlight in the middle of October of 2017 after a story broke with numerous allegations of sexual harassment and assault by producer Harvey Weinstein, who I'll mention later. And Alyssa Milano tweeted, for any woman who's been sexually harassed or assaulted to write Me Too, and it took off from there. In response, many men and people in Hollywood, politics, and newsrooms have been since accused of misconduct or assault and have subsequently been fired or voluntarily stepped away, although we do know some that have faced no repercussions as of now. You can hit the next slide, Erin. Thank you. Wanted to talk about some people who have been accused on the conservative side. So Trent Frakes is a former U.S. Rep of Arizona. He's a prominent pro-life Republican and sponsored and voted for many anti-abortion bills throughout his over decade-long career. He recently, late 2017, resigned when the House Ethics Committee announced that it would investigate allegations of sexual harassment and misconduct against him. He reportedly asked staffers to be surrogate mothers for him and his wife, and the employees believed that he wanted to have sexual relations. One of the accused actually stated that he offered her $5 million to be a surrogate. Roy Moore is one more well-known. He served as the 28th and 32nd Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Alabama. He was removed both of those terms, both times for failing to perform his duties. The first time for not removing the 10 Commandments from public property, and then the second time for refusing to comply with federal law allowing same-sex marriage. He was the Republican nominee for the 2017 U.S. Senate special election in Alabama that was going to fill in for the seat of Attorney General Jeff Sessions. 1 month before the election, he was accused of sexual assault and molestation from women who were 14, 16, and 28 years old at the time. More women have come out accusing him of having relationships with them when they were also teenagers, and Moore was in his 30s. He lost the election to pro-choice Democrat Doug Jones by less than 2% of the vote. He's since refused to concede, and he also has ties to white nationalists and believes that Christianity should be the law of the land, as you see with his failure to comply with not allowing same-sex marriage. And then most famously, Donald Trump, the president of the United States, has had at least 15 women accuse him of sexual misconduct, assault, and lewd behavior. His assault allegations have their own Wikipedia page. Allegations are also out there against him walking in on Miss Teen USA pageant contestants while they were in their dressing room. He admits to sexually assaulting women in the infamous Grab Them by the Pussy 2005 audio recording that was released right before the election, but we all know that he was elected. And the White House official response is that all of these women are lying. Right? So misconduct and abuse, as we know, is not subject to just one portion of ideology or within one industry. So I wanted to touch on people who have been accused who are viewed as leftists and also in the media. So Al Franken, the former U.S. Senator from Minnesota, he resigned earlier this month after allegations of sexual misconduct with photo evidence surfaced. Harvey Weinstein, as I mentioned earlier as well, prominent film producer. He was an advocate and fundraiser for left-leaning organizations, and more than 80 women have accused him of sexual misconduct, assault, abuse, and rape. He also has his own Wikipedia page for his accusations, and he has since been removed from the Weinstein Company. Other notable men in media that have been accused anywhere from misconduct to assault have been Louis C.K., Matt Lauer, James Franco, Aziz Ansari, Charlie Rose, Glenn Thrush, Jeffrey Tambor, and Kevin Spacey. So responses from anti-abortion or pro-life proponents have been overwhelmingly not supportive of the Me Too movement or making no comment. Those that did make comments typically pivoted the conversation to shame abortion. One pro-life response that I found that was written by a man, and I state that because the title actually made it explicit that he was a man, claimed abortion lets these crimes go unnoticed. He's talking about abortion, and that abortion enables assault. A lot of pro-life platforms were apathetic or even kind in their language for former Representative Trent Franks. And there are also several pro-life platforms that insinuated that this is only a problem on the left, that Franken, Weinstein, and other, quote, abortion industry supporters are all the same. Many pro-life organizations, including Susan B. Anthony List, which is a very prominent lobbying organization, still support Trump. Specifically with Roy Moore's race in Alabama, the National Right to Life endorsed Moore before allegations came out and did not make a comment afterwards. The Republican National Committee continued their endorsement as well. Susan B. Anthony List, which I mentioned in the previous slide, declined to comment on Roy Moore and the race. Pro-life platforms ran pieces about the race with little to no mention about the multitude of allegations surrounding Moore. Alabama Citizens for Life, a local pro-life organization, obviously in Alabama, continues to compare Moore and Doug Jones on their website that's pretty favorably in support of more. Breitbart ran an advertisement after the allegations, and Flip Benham and Rusty Thomas of Operation Rescue even went so far as to go to the press conference after these allegations came out to defend Moore in front of the press. And from there, I'll pass it back to Pamela.
Thank you very much. Just slow to unmute. Thank you so much, Jessica. So this portion of the webinar brings us to our discussion with Sarah Seltzer, who is a writer. Sarah's based in New York and uses pronouns she, her, and can be found on Twitter at Sarah Seltzer. Hi, Sarah.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us. I really appreciate it, and I can't wait to hear more about your piece in The Nation. So you recently wrote a piece titled "Me Too Has Debunked the Lean In Philosophy." And I was hoping that you could give a brief summary of the piece and tell us what inspired you to write it.
Yeah, I mean, so the piece is about how so much energy, both feminist energy and just sort of general self-help energy in the last decade or so has gone to kind of women's self-improvement in the workplace. How there's been this real trend in books that sort of encourage women to be a boss and, you know, change their negotiation styles. And so the mother of all this was Sheryl Sandberg's Lean In. And you know, in the piece, I talk about how even those of us who were critical of that book from the very beginning, you know, there were some ideas in it that were very seductive, because many people, wherever you work, many women or people who are at any kind of social disadvantage in the workplace get the sense all the time that something is wrong, that something's not quite right, that they're not advancing the way they should or not being treated the way they should be. And so to have these kind of ideas that Sandberg was putting forth in her book, that maybe it's about, you know, our inner, our inner gendered assumptions about how we should behave, and maybe women aren't nice enough or asking firmly enough, had its appeal. And so I think that for me, you know, first of all, the more science and data you read about the workplace, the more you see that that's actually just sort of not correct, that, you know, no matter how women behave in the workplace, the studies bear out that they're being discriminated against, that there's no other factor that can be narrowed down to, you know, why women aren't advancing as quickly. And then the second part is that, you know, my own industry, which is media, was very hard hit by Me Too. Men from broadcast, from print, from legacy media, from new media, including one of my former bosses, have been accused, have been fired. You know, the allegations are in some cases just absolutely outrageous. And, you know, far beyond even what some of us heard or suspected. So the idea that there's been so much energy on being introspective about our workplace negotiation skills, rather than energy spent by the people at the top either punishing predators or correcting the wage gap, started really making me feel very angry, and, you know, in the weeks as these, you know, allegations came out. So so that's kind of the energy behind the piece, that why, you know, I mean, there have been all these conferences. I looked at the titles of a number of different books about being a lady boss, and, you know, act less like a nice girl, and you know, many of them were, you know, even worse than some of them had a lot of good practical advice. But, you know, it's just one of many, many examples of how when there's some kind of social injustice that manifests itself on a personal level, the onus, it's easier to put the onus on the people who are being hurt and say, well, this is what you can change. And it's much harder to look at the system and say we need to change it. But I think this is a moment when a lot of people are sort of saying we need to look at the bigger picture, and instead of starting from the bottom up, start from the top down.
Yes, thank you for that. Thank you for that. And I do think that, as Erin mentioned earlier, it's a provocative piece, even though it really resonates with me. So the idea that so much of this labor is put on the part of women who are receiving and people who are receiving this kind of harassment, and particularly, as a Black woman, I'm really, it's been an interesting exploration for me, because my neck jerked the second I heard lean in because I was thinking, you've got to be kidding me, not to acknowledge the fact that there are all of these reasons, including a lot of stereotypes about assertive Black women and assertive women in general, that kind of hinder and make that a laughable piece of advice. But when you add this extra layer of how women experience harassment in the workplace, then it really does but it calls the question, and I don't think enough people have moved there. But I think you took it there. So hats off to you. You get a fluff of the afro. So since you wrote the piece, do you have other ideas for how people in power, men in power, and other people with privilege can step up to the plate when it comes to addressing both the structures and then, the general culture? And I'm thinking, specifically, you mentioned working in media. I come from, before I moved into reproductive justice work, I spent many years working in advertising. Right. And I was in the sales side of advertising, which is a particularly raucous reputation. And when people would ask me whether Mad Men is accurate, and I'm like, oh, there's points of it that are excruciatingly accurate, including the lack of Black people. So I'm just curious, having come from that background and then thinking about, I feel like I have a firm grasp on what I experienced, what I saw and witnessed. And then now it's like, well, not that the labor is on women to do this work and to solve this problem, but do you have any ideas how people in privilege can step up to the plate?
Yeah, I mean, they're just sort of the beginnings of ideas. But so another piece that I worked on for Not for the Nation, for Refinery 29, was about a women-led company that wanted to buy the Weinstein Company's assets. And they had, I don't think that they're going to get the deal, crazily enough. But they had some very interesting ideas about how to structure the company so that this kind of stuff was less likely to happen, including having, external review boards that are independent of both HR and management, so that there's a mechanism for accountability that's independent, kind of like having an ombudsman. That's one thing. Another is having seminars, instead of having training for workers on how to negotiate, having seminars for top leadership on power imbalance and workplace bullying and sexual harassment and all these issues, having them be mandatory part of being in upper management. I personally think is a great idea. I mean, I don't necessarily think that a seminar is going to stop really predatory behavior, but I do like the idea of having leadership have to sit around and actually think about how they treat people. Unionization is obviously, I mean, there are problems in unions too, right? I mean, anytime you have an organization, it will somehow, the tendency may be to replicate the hierarchies of that are in the outside world. But I do think that unionization and having collective bargaining and having unions really start to focus on this as a big issue, and make it a priority, is really important. I know a lot of digital newsrooms are organizing, and I think that, you know, one of the reasons that we're seeing this in this sort of flood of stories in advertising, in media, in Hollywood, in politics, is a lot of these are industries where things are a little less corporate and they're a little loosey-goosey, like you socialize with your colleagues after work, people's, you know, and there are figures in these industries that have power outside their job structure. It's not necessarily the same as, you know, a corporate VP who's accountable to HR. If there's someone who's like a mover and shaker in an industry that's very reputation based, then, you know, it's hard to quantify that power. So I think that that's something that's more difficult to combat structurally. But I do think that if the jobs are unionized and you're not as afraid of losing your job, that can be helpful. I also just think, like, working for sort of general social justice, like safety net issues is actually really important for harassment, because if your healthcare, if your ability to pay for your kids, you know, medical needs is contingent on your job, which it is for most of us, you're going to be less likely to speak up. And if there's a better safety net in place, whether it's a universal healthcare or universal basic income or some of these sort of pipe dream social safety net issues, that it can actually, you know, make a huge difference. Or, you know, really good paid medical leave, paid family leave. If you experience a trauma in the workplace and you need to take some time off, paid medical leave could be really helpful. So I think that's, you know, that's sort of an intersectional way of looking at solving the problem. But I do think that, you know, that it is all connected, because in America in particular, we're often all living paycheck to paycheck. Everything is so tenuous, and that's something that some white collar and blue collar and all sorts of, it's shared across all industries, right? We're all kind of hanging on in a lot of industries. So
that's
talking about security is
very
really important
point.
issue.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sorry to interrupt you. I was just thinking, so that's just a very interesting point. And when I think about my experience in advertising, for example, and how hard it was to break in to the field, and then particularly how hard it was to break into a field where there aren't a lot of people of color, certainly aren't a lot of Black women working at that time in the 90s in radio sales, at least in the city I was in. And a huge part of navigating through advertising is relationship and, you know, networking, and that there's that balance, kind of to go back to what you were saying about lean in, that balance between having a policy within your workplace that allows for more junior level people to have access to people of privilege so that they can build the relationship and show the quality of their work, but also finding that balance that doesn't allow for that to be taken advantage of or used as leverage against people. And I saw time and time again that there were just these abuses of that power. So I think a lot of the ideas that you ran through definitely do address that. And then I'm also interested just to think about it intersectionally, that, you know, I navigate through this time thinking about it in terms of, when is it time for Me Too for women of color and Black women? And so I'm particularly fascinated by the emergence of some high-profile figures within the movement, like Gretchen Carlson or Megyn Kelly. And I want to get your thoughts on, you know, what does it mean for the Me Too movement to have Megyn Kelly be such a high-profile figure when she is viewed, in my personal opinion, she has a long track record of race baiting and racist comments, And then the same thing with Gretchen Carlson, not to the same degree as Megyn Kelly, but Gretchen Carlson's got her own page on Media Matters as well. So I'm just curious what you think about the movement and what folks within that movement, people who have taken leadership within that movement, can do to address that, to me, a glaring problem.
Yeah, I mean, the Fox News stuff is really fascinating because, you know, it's a question of, is the enemy of my enemy my friend now? And I, you know, my feeling is, you know, back in, I guess, 2015 and 2016, I was at Flavor Wire and I was writing about Megyn Kelly a lot and how appalled I was by her kind of new status as a feminist heroine because she's such a race baiter. I mean, in this absurd, awful Fox News way that, you know, I don't understand. I mean, the redemption narrative is very seductive, and there was this big profile of her in the New York Times, and you know, it was just, you know, ridiculous. You know, it didn't really challenge her, and you know, obviously now she has a very prominent position, and she's been kind of mainstreamed, and I think that it's really important to call that out just as loudly as we can, and you know. I'm not, like, for me, it's not clear yet if there are, I mean, the crazy thing about what's happening with Me Too is that it's happening in so many industries so quickly that I'm not sure if there are, at least from my perspective, and maybe I'm wrong, clear leaders. I guess the only people you could kind of see as leaders would be like some of the more prominent Hollywood voices, and then they obviously, the activists that they brought to the Golden Globes. But I think that that's both good and bad because, I mean, the great thing, it kind of reminds me a little of, you know, any sort of left-wing movement that's non-hierarchical, because it means both, it's great that there's no hierarchy, but it also means anyone can kind of jump in and say, oh, I'm part of this movement too. And, you know, you don't want to police the borders, but I do think, I mean, I've always felt that, you know, and your work at Reproaction is an example of this, that that it is okay to say you are not a feminist if you race bait on TV. You're not a feminist if you're restricting access to abortion. Like, that's not part of the sisterhood. We're sorry about what happened to you, and it's an example of why we need feminism. You know, I mean, I think the most effective way to kind of push back against people like Gretchen Carlson and Megyn and say that, you know, everything that they kind of railed against at Fox News is actually what has ended up providing the framework for them to speak up against their harasser. You know, so, I mean, it's a classic thing. It's a sort of a classic problem, and we're seeing it really in droves now with you know, Caitlin Flanagan and Katie Royf and all these women who have kind of, you know, and there all happens to be sort of these glamorous white women types, of course, who have made their name kind of being like, well, I'm not really a feminist, and like, feminists have just gone too far with the anti-rape stuff, coming back into prominence. And it's a very kind of tricky thing to navigate, because the minute you criticize them, you're accused of being anti-sisterhood. Isn't feminism all about sisterhood and supporting your fellow women? So it's a moment to stick up for nuance. And for saying, you know, this is a problem that affects everywhere from Fox News to some of the most liberal, like ostensibly liberal places. And, you know, it's true that there's a universality to it, but that doesn't mean that the movement against it has to include every repellent view.
That's so true. That's so true. And obviously, you know, I personally believe that there's an opportunity here. That as we see people like Gretchen Carlson take over, I think it's a Miss America pageant, and Megyn Kelly, you know, working at NBC now, that this is an opportunity to educate, you know, to folks who might not necessarily be aware, or folks who just are struggling with how to navigate that, you know, you don't get to suddenly emerge after over a decade of race baiting at Fox and just drop that cloak and walk into this movement and act as if it's not also a system of oppression that you've been propping up at Fox. So yes, I agree. And I think I need a t-shirt that says it's time for nuance. That's fantastic. I'm going to borrow that.
Yeah. And I think like the last thing I'll say is like, that's conservatism, is like opposing every sort of progressive framework except when it applies to you, you know? So like, that's Megyn Kelly, is like every, you know, conservative on every issue, not even just conservative, but often loathsome. Oh, but when she gets mistreated, suddenly she sees the light. And so that's a very, you know, it's a very seductive narrative, like the homophobic senator who suddenly supports gay rights because their kid comes out of the closet. People love those stories, but it's very important, like, to be on your guard for that kind of narrative, because it's like everything, human rights for me and my family, but not for you.
Yeah. And I think long term, what it does is it perpetuates this idea that that this is a privileged movement for white women. And so, looking at it through the lens, when we see those kind of high profile figures, when we see that hypocrisy, when you have like Megyn Kelly calling out physical abuse at Fox, but, saying that it's perfectly okay to assault a young woman, a teenager, for a police officer to assault her at a pool party, then because she's Black, then the world sees that, and the broader world sees that and tries to make sense of it, and then it basically is a narrative of privilege. So long term, Me Too is a movement that I strongly support, and I want to benefit all people, but I do think that this is one of those moments where we really can benefit from applying, an intersectional analysis to it, which I love to do. So I had one final question, then we're going to kick it back to Jessica. We'll have Q&A at the end. So if you do have questions, and I see a couple have popped up, please drop them into the question tab of GoToWebinar control panel. But Sarah, one more question. So we've talked a little bit about this, but I'm curious for your thoughts of what you see in the near future and the long-term future of the Me Too and the subsequent Time's Up movement. And I'm thinking, like, do you see it becoming more localized? Do you see it being another panel at another progressive convention? What do you think? What do you think the near and far future is?
That is a really good question. It's a little unknowable, because I think many of us probably would have predicted that momentum would have died, and then it keeps being revitalized by new accusations. I think we all know that there are still journalists working on stories. So depending on what comes out, the conversation could keep going. And I do think that this is not the, that there's always this feeling that, oh, the backlash is coming. And I do think the backlash is kind of here. I think we're in a backlash moment at this very evening, with the Caitlin Flanagan piece in the Atlantic, and the Aziz Azar, sort of poorly reported but very interesting Aziz Ansari allegations in Babe magazine this weekend. And people are kind of seizing on that to say this movement has gone too far. But I think it's going to keep rolling on. I do think that there's going to be, I think that there's a danger. There's always a danger in getting too caught up in sort of the nitty-gritty details of one of these stories. I think part of the power of the movement has been that there just keep being more stories. So I think if that continues, then the movement will continue. I think I'm very, I'm suspicious of anything short of structural change. I'm not thinking that there needs to be a revolution in the next year, but I do think that I want to see some of these companies that have fired prominent men actually revisit their policies. So I think that's sort of going to be a big question that hangs in the air. Like, will some of these reporters go back to NBC and go back to, you know, the studios in Hollywood and say, what's going on now? Like, have there been any trainings on sexual harassment? Are there new HR manuals? You know, has anything else changed, or, you know, was it just kind of like cutting off the head of the snake and leaving the rest of the snake intact? And, you know, I'm, you know, always curious to see. I mean, I think that, as Pamela said, there's a real opportunity for intersectional feminist organizing, because in fact, what's really interesting about sexual harassment is it does kind of know no borders and no boundaries. You know, we've seen stories from almost every industry now, from Fox News to hotel workers, and, you know, it could be an opportunity. I mean, the Time's Up thing is really interesting because it's, it seems like the right moment. Like, these Hollywood women are showing solidarity, and you know, it seems like it's headed in a good direction. But one is always you're always wary that, like, privilege and egos will get in the way of real collective action. So I feel like, you know, it really, there's both like enormous potential for great work to be done and also potential for things to get derailed. So it's hard to make a prediction, but it does feel like a really powerful moment still.
Definitely. And as organizers, we see it as an opportunity. So when they go low and when things seem scattered, we organize. Thank you so much, Sarah. You hold on for a little bit, and I'm going to kick it back to Jessica.
Thank you. So with all of this information, what can you do? What can we all do as individuals? So I try to come up with some points. There are certainly more, but as is mentioned, we're still within like the middle of this movement. So you can ask men and other people of privilege to step up in your life if possible. I know that it's not the responsibility of the marginalized to, you know, be the ones only advocating for themselves. And sometimes it can be difficult to ask people of privilege in your life, be that a man, white person, a cis person, to step up. But if you feel comfortable, you can do that. Support those sharing their stories. Don't call someone's story a lie. Believe them. As we know, false rape and sexual assault allegations are incredibly low, and supporters are often not believed. And as this webinar was going, I actually came up with a portion of that to go off of supporting people sharing their stories is to support whisper networks. To give an example, was a list called the Shitty Media Men that had it was supposed to be an anonymous list for anyone to comment about issues that they have faced with certain men. And the person who created that list took it down within 24 hours because it had blown up so big, and she was fearful. And then several months later, Harper's was working on a story to out her, and her wish was to remain anonymous. So she actually ended up writing a piece in The Cut, which I highly recommend, which is titled, "I Started the Media Men List. My name is Moira Donegan," talking about the fears she faced and her reasonings behind creating that specific whisper network. But there are whisper networks throughout all industries in order for people of marginalized communities to connect with other people in that community to warn them about predators. And lastly, do self-care, take care of yourself, take care of others. I know that I have really appreciated when people close to me in my life have reached out when someone that I looked up to had been accused, because it can be really hurtful to see these people that you idolize, or maybe even people that you know in your own life. Those can be tough to handle. So reach out to the people that you care about and take care of yourself in whatever way that means for you. And if anyone also has tips for what they can do, happy to hear it as well. But I will kick it back to both Pamela and Erin. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Jessica. I think that's me who's up next. So So before we move to the Q&A section, just a couple housekeeping items. First, we want to really encourage you to plug into Reproaction campaigns. Sign up for alerts at www.reproaction.org. If you're on our email list, you will not miss a thing in terms of invitations to our monthly Act and Learn webinars, to action alerts, to heads up when we release new toolkits for activists on the ground. So that's a really great resource. We also want you to follow us on social media. We are Reproaction on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. So you to sign up for or save the date and plan to sign up for our next Reproaction Act and Learn webinar. Next month's topic is yearly exams, taking control of your reproductive health care. So that's always a critical topic. Taking care of ourselves is a critical part of reproductive justice, and activists need to practice self-care, and so we want to make sure we're practicing self-care in addition to the advocacy that everyone on this line does for reproductive calendars for Tuesday, February 20th from 7 to 8 p.m. Eastern. I'll be glad to join you next month, hopefully with a better voice, and I'll pass it back to Pamela.
Thank you very much, Erin. So let's just dive right into some questions. We've got both Erin and Sarah on the line. So we have an anonymous question that I'm going to pose to both of you. The question reads, I'm interested in the Me Too Time's Up movement as a galvanizing focus for popular mobilization. And I think the Legal Defense Fund is an amazing, I believe they have legal recourse or the capability, desire to take legal action. Do you recommend any resources for restorative justice? Sarah, you want to take that?
Sure. Yeah, I think that, you know, my twin brother is he's a employee side employment lawyer who brings discrimination cases to court, and it's a very, like, the journalistic and legal standards for harassment and assault and all the stuff that we're talking about with Me Too are very high, and I think that's a problem in and of itself that's probably worthy of a whole other discussion. Like, but you know, there can be so it's completely reasonable that, first of all, although the government does take, my brother did take a case on behalf of undocumented workers, so it's this was pre-Trump, but you know, if you're undocumented, if you don't want to put a huge amount of time and energy and vulnerability into either going public through journalism by talking to a reporter or by going to a lawyer, I think that there are options for restorative justice. I'm not an expert on, like, mechanisms and organizations, but I do think that we're actually at a moment right now where we're seeing it happen in real time. There was a writer on the show, I think it was the show Community, who called out the runner, Dan Harmon, for harassing her, and he issued a really lengthy apology that she accepted. And I think that you know, we're seeing these kinds of conversations now because of Me Too that we might not have seen even a year ago. And it is a moment to if you think that you can have that kind of conversation safely. It is a really interesting moment, or, you know, it may be possible. You may need sort of a community organization to help you have that conversation if you don't feel like you can have it safely. But I've been hearing, you know, a lot of us have been joking about sort of the slew of apology emails a lot of women have been getting. So I do think that it is a moment for, like, multiple avenues, and I think all the different avenues are good. I'm in favor of whisper networks. I'm in favor of bringing lawsuits. I'm in favor of exposing people through journalism. I'm in favor of having one-on-one conversations. I'm in favor of trying to use restorative justice mechanisms. I think that all the options should be on the table. You know, and you know, sort of on a case-by-case basis. And I think that that's actually making the movement stronger. So I'm sorry, you know, I'm sorry I don't have specific restorative justice resources, but I do think that this is like a moment where that actually could be very effective.
Thank you for that. Erin, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I don't have much in the way of specific restorative justice resources, but I do want to speak just briefly to this concept of when you don't have options for recourse legally, and in some cases, again, even restorative justice, and I encourage people to check out that more on their own time to see if that's an option for them, but that's not going to be a safe option for everyone. And I just want to also underscore that there are things you can do to try to find more peace in your life. It's always going to be difficult after you've encountered sexual harassment and assault and abuse at the hands of other people, but you know, do make a choice. You certainly have a choice to what extent you want to engage with this person. I know that, you know, you, particularly in a social media era, it can be sometimes one of the most helpful things can simply be to block someone so you don't have to see them, or to mute them so that you don't have to see them and they don't even have to know that they've been blocked. I know another thing that can be helpful sometimes for people in recovery, recovering from the trauma, the very real trauma that comes with sexual harassment, assault, and other forms of abuse, in addition to working with therapists, is to also, you know, sometimes it's helpful to go through in your mind, do I want to reach my own form of internal forgiveness? Do I want to write a letter that I will never send because it's not safe for me to do so, that will help me to process what has occurred? And so I just want to stress there's a lot of stuff that you can do, even if it's not safe for you to pursue more formal channels.
Thank you for that, Erin. Our next question is from Emily. What are some concrete suggestions for reaching towards greater intersectionality within the Me Too movement? I'm gonna take a first stab at that. So thank you for your question, Emily. So I'm a huge fan of leading by example, which I see as somewhat different than doing the emotional labor, like performing the emotional labor for, you know, this broader movement. I'm super excited to see many reproductive justice organizations doing intersectional organizing on this issue. I know that I've seen some amazing conversations get started on Twitter from something that Sister Song has sent out. And I know that often we look towards these big national organizations, but you know, we're a grassroots organization, and often what you see is that this stuff gets done in a real concrete way on a much smaller scale, and can be a blueprint for what goes up. So what I'm encouraged by is that, you know, rather than put ourselves as a woman of color, rather than put myself in a position of trying to perform what should be done within the broader movement, I'm much more interested in finding ways to encourage intersectional organizing around this issue and around the hashtag, but also offline around this issue in the communities where we organize and in the work where we're organizing. So I strongly believe that where people feel comfortable, where you have a diverse audience, or even if it's, you know, a gathering of all Black women, or if it's a gathering that is just trans folk who are talking about their experience in the workplace, that is where the roots of that kind of revolutionary work can happen and really have a strong impact. The other suggestion that I have is, you know, I saw an interview on 60 Minutes that Oprah did with several of the Hollywood stars who participated in the Time's Up action during the Golden Globe. And I was so excited because it was, you know, very diverse, which made me super happy. But I was also excited about what that lent to the conversation. So I think what we can do is, you know, there are lots of people who are participating, from Ava to America to Oprah, who are lending a voice that is not necessarily a privileged voice, even within Hollywood spaces. Oprah obviously is privileged, but that those are the folks who, even at the celebrity level, we can kind of find ways to organize around the work that they're doing, like that interview or an article, or if they, you know, decide to do something going forward. But I do take great encouragement in the fact that as a Black woman, I have the power to organize. I have the power to work to dismantle reproductive oppression, and organizing is my absolute joy. So as I organize, I'm taking Me Too movement and putting it to the forefront of my mind and thinking, how can I do this in a way that demonstrates and leads by example and applies a more intersectional analysis to the work? And then I'll shut up. Erin, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Pamela, let's go on to another question. That was beautiful.
Oh, thank you. Hold on one second. Okay. So I think we have time for one more question. And so this is another anonymous question, and the attendee says something that struck them about the reactions to allegations against Aziz Ansari was that, quote, he wasn't her employer, as if the Me Too movement is only about people in the workplace. When we are really trying to teach people that it's happening everywhere, how do we further the dialogue that is a culture of harassment and sexual violence targeting women and femmes, and not just boss-employee-based power? Sarah, you want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's tricky, because I actually do think that it's two very linked issues, right? Because I do think that in the workplace, it's so much more than in the workplace. It's not, sexual harassment is not just about sex. Like, when I was writing another article, there was a stat that said that, you know, an astoundingly high number of LGBT people in the office feel bullied. And so there is like an abuse of power issue happening in the workplace. And then the Aziz thing is also opening up this other can of worms that's very distinctly related. That's about, you know, the very fraught language around sex and around dating and around consent and power and sort of who has a voice in the dating world. And I think that it's just really important to keep having both of those conversations and acknowledge the places that they overlap and the places that they don't. I think like the Aziz thing is very much, a lot of people have been saying, there was that viral New Yorker story that came out a couple weeks ago called Cat Person. That was also about sort of that very fraught power dynamic that can occur in dating in you know, our current sort of our era of texting, our era of online dating, our era of internet porn, and it's still the patriarchy. You know, the patriarchy is like the third person on a lot of dates, no matter who's on the date, because what, you know, whoever it is, we all have that kind of internalized patriarchy that, you know, that can really complicate issues of consent. And I think that some good faith people are having that conversation right now about the Aziz Ansari story, and I'm seeing some really, really interesting conversations along those lines. And I'm also seeing the really terrible takes that are sort of like, well, it's not illegal, it's not workplace harassment, so why are we talking about it? So pushing back that is really important. Well, also kind of in the workplace discussions, it's very tricky, because in the workplace discussion, it's important to say this isn't just about sexual desire, it's about the abuse of power. And I think that's also true on dates, honestly. So I think, you know, there's a lot, like, again, like Nuance 2018, you know, keep pushing. We have to keep in our interpersonal conversations about this. I mean, I was dropping off my kid at preschool this morning, and I heard parents talking about this. And I heard a woman saying, I mean, I'm sorry that she had bad sex, but it wasn't right. I just I think like there are these, yeah, exactly. There are these interpersonal conversations happening that if you have a relationship with somebody, like, you know, if you can and if you feel comfortable doing it, like push the issue, ask the tough questions, you know, acknowledge that you might not have all the answers yourself, but that these are things that are making you uncomfortable about the reaction. I think that it's important to sort of like really push out that conversation that's starting to happen because of this story, because I actually think it's a really important conversation that gets into so many deep and complicated issues. And I do hope that rather than derailing the issue, it just kind of expands it. I don't know if Erin and Pamela have other thoughts on this, because it's a tricky one.
Yeah, this is Erin. I'll jump in here. There's 3 things I want to share about what this has brought to the forefront for me, specifically when we're talking about things. You know, the initial flood of Me Too stories that were going on the internet in early October, many of the personal stories that you were seeing people share on social media were not about workplace violence necessarily or employer-based violence, but just sexual harassment and violence that women and people experience throughout their lives. The common thread in all of these stories is that it's ultimately about power and control on behalf of the abuser, and sometimes it is, and sometimes it's just pure sexual power and control. Sometimes there's the economic control element as well. The second thing that I wanted to convey about this, that it brings forward for me, is that there's a cycle here, right? Like our economic life impacts our dating life impacts our economic life, and and in addition, excuse me, can you hear me or not? Are you able to hear me? Hello?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I was getting some text messages that hearing me was not possible, so I'm glad to hear that. So our economic life impacts our dating life impacts our economic life. We also know that, and I don't mean to imply that what was happening in describing that story was purely dating. I want to add another layer that we also know that sexual assault impacts our economic life. It impacts our ability to go to work, our ability to be present at work, our ability to advance in the workplace. We also know that that economic life also impacts our dating life, right? And so all of these things are reciprocal, but I wanted to share that. And then the last thing that I think is really important that's come up out of the Aziz Ansari story, and I'm glad there's so much discussion happening, is there really is a new conversation that's starting to come in as part of the Me Too cultural conversation, where we're talking about coercion as well, and just frankly how crappy a lot of sexual encounters are for women who are having sexual encounters with men, and how there's a routine lack of respect for women and their bodies that happens. And so I think it's a really important conversation that's come forward.
Thanks. I'm so sorry, everybody. This is Pamela. I'm back. I lost audio for a second, so I do apologize.
And then Pamela, I think I could really wanted to jump in this last minute.
Good deal. So not knowing where we left off, I'm gonna, I think we're right at time. So I think we can wrap up. And again, I do apologize so much for dropping off like that. Technical difficulties in the middle of freezing weather. I'm blaming it on the cold. I want to thank Sarah Seltzer so much. We are going to send out a link to your article in the recap of this webinar that we're going to send out probably tomorrow. I also want to thank Jessica Inslee for organizing and taking the lead on this webinar. And thank you to my co-director, Erin Matson, for struggling through, even though you sound like you're losing your voice. So thank you for toughing that out. Thank you to our attendees. And again, we will be sending a recording of this webinar out to everybody. And I'm sorry we didn't get to all of your questions, but we really do appreciate you attending and such great questions and such a great discussion. Thank you, everybody, and have a great evening.